Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History. Today, we're going to kind of wrap up this time period that we know as Reconstruction. And one of the legacies of Reconstruction ending is kind of the ushering in of this time period that we refer to as Jim Crow. And this is a time period in which you're going to see a lot of the advancements that African Americans had made during Reconstruction are going to be taken away. And we've already talked about how certainly we've seen voting rights taken especially away from African American men. During this time period, you're going to see how access to education and economic opportunity are going to be taken away as well. And so the term actually comes from a songbook from a traveling minstrel show that very much belittled the role and the identity of African Americans during that time period. So certainly, again, one of the tough legacies and hard history of the ending of Reconstruction. Looking at our learning objective for today, we're going to be able to explain how Democrats as a party began to steadily regain control of the Southern government as you start to see support wane for more radical Reconstruction policies. It just begins to decrease over time, and people in many ways want the South to really deal with their own issues and to fix themselves. I don't feel it's their responsibility to do so. So Grant's administration is marred or has the scars of corruption, in particular what's called the whiskey rings, and certainly puts a very difficult task ahead as Northerners begin to lose interest in Reconstruction. Again, one of the big reasons for this is that people are starting to ever look at the South as needing just to fix their own issues. Grant is going to win re-election, pretty close election in 1872, despite a split over that corruption earlier in his first term within the Republican Party. And actually, the split in the Republican Party occurs after the creation of the liberal Republican Party, and one that definitely tended to be more radical for that time period. And supported largely by that new divide in the Republican Party, that liberal Republicans, you're going to see the amnesty, and this was an Amnesty Act of 1872. And amnesty is one of our vocab words that we've gone through in this unit, and certainly we talked about it with Lincoln and wanting to pardon. Well, that's exactly what this one does, is it pardoned most former Confederates, and it really did give the opportunity for Democrats to begin to regain more control over Southern state governments, which is going to lead to a national shift as we get closer to the next presidential election. And so you're going to see that connection, again, amnesty and pardons. So as we head into the next election after Grant's second term is finished, and he's definitely not going to run again, the Republicans nominate Rutherford B. Hayes, and he's going up against Samuel Tilden in the election of 1876 over the presidency of the United States. And this is probably, if not the most disputed, one of the most disputed elections in American history or U.S. history, because the returns that came back were in doubt. So the outcome of this whole election was uncertain, and it was uncertain for a long time. Those of you who, when this is being recorded in the year 2021, you might recall the 2020 election took some time. But certainly this one took even longer. There was a special commission that was brought in. It was set up by Congress to review the election results from several of these states to try to determine the outcome. Well, there's some backdoor dealings going on during this election. And in some cases, it looked like Tilden might have beaten Rutherford B. Hayes if it weren't for some disputed states. And what ends up coming out of the special commission is a bargain. It's called the Compromise of 1877. And essentially what it does is it grants the South the ability to return from this kind of pseudo-military control that had occurred under radical Reconstruction. And in exchange, a little bit more autonomy. Again, they'll be fully admitted. Won't see the military presence in the South anymore. And in exchange, they're going to support and not fight the commission's decision to elect Hayes. So essentially, it's the White House for more control of their region. And so, again, probably one of the more shady, backdoor dealing elections, disputed election, for sure, when it comes to U.S. history, if not the most. Under Hayes' presidency, the federal government is pretty much no longer going to attempt to reshape Southern society. And again, a lot of Northerners are looking at this and saying, you know what? The South, it's not our issue. The South can fix itself. It's their problem, not ours. And so Reconstruction really does come to an end during Hayes' presidency. And really, it's with the Compromise of 1877 that kind of marks the official end of Reconstruction. So which of the following began to happen during the Grant administration? Radical Republicans became more powerful. Corruption charges weakened Democrats. Many Northerners began to think of the South should solve its own problems, or most white Southerners supported Republicans. Take a moment, pause if you need to. We know that the Radical Republicans are losing their influence, so we know it's not A. Corruption began to actually hurt and weaken Republicans more, especially with Grant's corruptions during his first term. And it's at this point that, the number of white Southerners actually would support Democrats as opposed to Republicans. So really our best answer here is C, is that many white Northerners just began to think of the South as they should just solve their own problems. So the last kind of idea here is that after Reconstruction, the South experiences a major political shift, but also some industrial growth that's kind of really going to define this term of the New South. So when Reconstruction ends, you do see that power shift now more to the Democrats. Republicans still maintain a lot of control in the North, but you're going to see that shift now in the Southern states to the other major political party at the time, that'd be the Democrats. And some Southerners wanted to build what they called the New South. They wanted more industry in the region, and they wanted to take advantage of the abundant resources and mineral wealth, the coal, the iron, tobacco and cotton and lumber as well. And so when we look at this time period of the New South, what you're going to see is you're going to see steel mills, you're going to see tobacco processing, which even though tobacco was being grown prior to the Civil War, certainly, and it's going to take a little bit of a hit too. When we look at this chart, you can see the agricultural growth of tobacco really drop between 1860 and 1870, and it's never really able to, go back to where it was. But the processing of that tobacco is going to now happen in the South. So there's a little bit of a shift there. You're going to see with cotton, certainly going to go, even above where it was in 1860, rice, much the same, and even corn. But tobacco never really fully recovers. But the processing of that tobacco will be important. You're going to see that while agriculture remains kind of the South's main economic activity, industry is going to have a really dramatic gain. And you are going to see also more railroads being built in the South during this time period as well, because they now want to take those products across the country. So you're going to see a lot of those dramatic gains in the 1880s after Reconstruction's over. So textiles, the lumber industries, you're going to see certainly, like we've mentioned already, the processing of tobacco. You're going to see the steel mills with the iron ore. And so you're really going to see that introduction of more industry in the South. Still does not compare to what you would find in the northern part of the United States this time period, but certainly more than they would have had prior to the Civil War. Also, you've got the South needing to repay a lot of debt. And so agriculturally, Southerners tend to focus more on cash crops. And cash crops, again, are those farm crops that are raised in order to be sold for money, like tobacco, like corn, like cotton. Okay, and even though sharecropping and the reliance on cash crop was a driving force, in some ways it kept the South from really Southern agriculture from advancing and to really, match what the leaps and bounds that were occurring in the heartland or in what we would call the Great Plains of today in the United States. So they're never really able to match some of that progress that's made in other parts of the country. And at that time period, we would have called that the West. So what term would we use, or what does the term the New South refer to? Is it A, this era of new cotton plantations, a second Civil War, an era of racial harmony, or a new era of Southern industry? So when we look at these options, certainly you're not going to see the reintroduction of these cotton plantations, even though cotton's going to play a role. It's going to be replaced by things like sharecropping instead. We're not going to see the introduction of a second Civil War, so it's not going to be B either. And you're not going to see this new era of racial harmony. In fact, you start to see more violence towards African Americans during this time period, especially with the White League and the groups like the KKK beginning to engage in more violence against African Americans. So our best answer here is definitely that era of new Southern industry. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is going to wrap up our discussion on Reconstruction. From here, we're going to get into a little bit more of the Transcontinental Railroad and the development of more of, the Western frontier. And we'll get into, the development of the heartland, and we'll get into, again, connecting the country through the Transcontinental Railroad in our next unit. I want to, for my students, make sure you've been following along with the guided notes. Ask any questions that you have, those of you who are listening. I hope that in some way we've helped you to better understand the historical impact and the legacy of this time period of Reconstruction. Have a wonderful day, and thanks for listening.